In the early 1960s, Japan was a nation in recovery, striving to rebuild after the devastation of World War II. The cities, once scarred by bombs and bullet shells, were now bustling with new construction and the hum of industry. Streets were filled with the sounds of merchants, the laughter of children, and the clatter of bicycles. Neon lights also began to flicker to life in the entertainment districts, symbolizing the country's rapid economic growth. Amidst this backdrop of renewal and hope, there was a collective sense of optimism. However, Japan was still grappling with numerous issues, one of which was the rising tide of crime. Beneath the surface of a country that was fighting for progress lay numerous chilling stories of deceit and murder. Among the many offenders apprehended in the 1960s, one of them stood out because of the sheer brutality of his actions. In 1963, Akira Nishiguchi, a 37-year-old man, committed crimes so heinous that they not only shocked the nation, but also brought immense shame upon his family, causing them to be shunned by the entire country. In fact, the viciousness of his actions was so profound that it forced the Japanese National Police Agency to re-evaluate and learn from their mistakes, so that such crimes would never happen again. In just a span of 2 months, Akira Nishiguchi embarked on a ruthless killing spree, claiming a total of 5 innocent lives. His methods were chillingly varied. Some were bludgeoned, others fatally stabbed, and one of his victims, an 81-year-old man, was strangled to death with his bare hands. Each act of violence painted a gruesome picture of a man driven by a dark and malevolent force. But despite the tireless efforts of the Japanese police, Akira had managed to elude capture time and time again, leaving the authorities in a state of increasing desperation. No one knew where this cold-hearted killer would strike next, and no one knew who his next victim would be. That is, until a sharp-eyed 10-year-old girl from a distant village recognized him and called him the messenger of evil. You're listening to Heinous, an Asian true crime podcast, brought to you by One Up Media. This episode may contain sensitive details and graphic imagery. Listener discretion is advised. Akira Nishiguchi was born on December 14, 1925, in the bustling city of Osaka, Japan. Born to devout Catholic parents, his upbringing was marked by a unique blend of faith and tradition. At the time, Christianity was not widespread in Japan. In fact, it was quite rare. However, Akira's parents had originated from the Goto Islands in Nagasaki, a group of islands known for their hidden Christian communities. These communities had a long history of enduring persecution, especially during the Edo period, when Christianity was banned in Japan. Until the late 1800s, residents of the islands had to practice their faith in secret, often at great personal risk. These beliefs and practices were then ultimately passed down through generations, with many parents going to great lengths to ensure that their children would continue to uphold Christianity. Akira's parents were in Osaka at the time of his birth to raise funds to invest in their family's fishing business back on the Goto Islands. After achieving their financial goals, they returned to their homeland when Akira was about 3 years old. Steeped in their strong religious beliefs, they had Akira baptized at the age of 5, and his father had harbored high hopes for his future. In particular, his father had envisioned a spiritual path for his son, wanting him to become a priest when he grew up. When Akira reached the age of junior high school, his parents immediately enrolled him into a Christian mission school. This institution, however, was run by strict Catholic missionaries and was known for its extremely rigorous discipline and harsh treatment of students. Students like Akira may have endured various types of punishment as part of the strict disciplinary practices, some of which included constant verbal insults, manual labor, and even corporal punishment such as public caning. The school's severe environment took a toll on young Akira, and by the second semester of his 3rd year, He could no longer endure the grueling demands. Despite being so close to graduation, Akira dropped out, unable to withstand the pressure any longer. Leaving school at just 16 years old filled Akira with a sense of failure and shame. His parents, who were at the time considered wealthy, had high expectations that Akira felt he could never meet. Overwhelmed and dejected, he chose to run away from home. Lost and without support, Akira wandered, grappling with his shattered confidence. But it was during this period of vulnerability that a resolute determination began to take root within him. Akira vowed to himself that he would become rich and powerful by any means necessary, even if it meant at the expense of others. 5 months after dropping out of school in 1942, Akira was arrested for robbery. At just 16 years old, he was fortunately spared from any criminal charges, but was confined to a juvenile detention facility. This was the first time he crossed the line of the law, but it would be far from his last. His next crime followed swiftly, setting off a chain reaction of increasingly brazen offenses, from which there seemed to be no return. Upon his release from the Juvenile Detention Center in 1945, Akira enrolled in an English course at an occupational training school in Osaka, aiming to become an interpreter for Allied servicemen. It now appears that he might have learned his lesson and was seeking a fresh start with a respectable job. However, this newfound direction was short-lived. Soon after, Akira found himself back in custody, this time as an adult. While the records do not specify the reason for this period of imprisonment, it is reported that during his incarceration, he married a 20-year-old woman from Fukuoka in 1946. The following year, just before completing his sentence, his wife gave birth to a son. Despite these significant life changes, prison did not reform Akira, because right after his release, he was ready to revert back to a life of crime. Using the English skills he had acquired during his time with the occupational forces, Akira went around the community extorting money from local businesses by pretending to be a representative of the Allied forces. Fortunately, he was quickly caught and apprehended, and the Osaka District Court sentenced him to 2 years in prison. Upon his third release from prison in 1950, he briefly partnered with an American soldier to open a bar in the city of Beppu. However, the soldier was later deployed to South Korea for the war, leaving Akira as the sole owner of the bar. Now that the bar's earnings wouldn't need to be split 2 ways, it allowed Akira to reap substantial profits, and he now had a steady stream of income. But despite this, he was not satisfied. Even though the income generated from owning the bar was recorded to be higher than the average salary in the area at the time, Akira wanted more. Still hungry for more wealth, Akira once again used his English skills and experience with the occupation forces to devise a new scheme. This scheme involved posing as an American officer and conning people who were interested in buying foreign vehicles. He would lure potential customers into a warehouse, claiming that he would sell the cars they were interested in at a massive discount. However, once they handed over their money, Akira would make an excuse and vanish with the cash. In 1952, Akira was arrested once again and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was eventually released in 1957, and records say that he stayed relatively quiet for the next 2 years. However, he resurfaced again in 1959 when news broke that he had been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for committing fraud. From the 1950s to the early 60s, Akira was in prison on at least 3 different occasions. Understandably, his wife grew tired of his criminal lifestyle and decided to file for a divorce. By this point, they already had 2 children, and with their father repeatedly going in and out of prison, it was the right decision for her to end the marriage. However, Akira knew that divorce was prohibited in the Catholic faith and used this as an excuse to get her to remarry him. By 1963, 36-year-old Akira Nishiguchi had already spent a total of 10 years behind bars across 4 convictions, including his time in juvenile detention. One might think 10 years was enough, but Akira would disagree because he was already on the hunt for his next victim. In late 1963, it was reported that Akira had taken on a job as a delivery driver for a logistics company in Yukuhashi, Fukuoka Prefecture to make a living. During this time, he learned that an employee of a Japanese tobacco corporation was using the company's delivery vans to collect large sums of money from distributors and the public. Akira saw this as an opportunity, and on October 18, 1963, he approached 58-year-old Ikuo Murata, one of the deliverymen from the tobacco company. He spoke with Murata, offered to help with the deliveries, and even wanted to show him some of the tobacco fields that he knew of. On that same day, the delivery van was being driven by 38-year-old Goro Mori, another employee of the tobacco plant, and seated in the passenger seats were Murata and Akira. Together, they traveled to an isolated mountain road west of Kanda Station in Fukuoka, and once they arrived, Akira led Murata to a secluded area, beat him to death with a hammer, and stole his bag of cash. He then proceeded to walk back to the car and fatally stab Mori, before abandoning both the vehicle and the two bodies at a mountain pass 2 kilometers away from the scene. Akira then made a getaway with the cash bag, which contained, at the time, over $17,000 when adjusted for inflation. Fortunately, a witness that was nearby saw Akira leaving the area, and the police were promptly alerted. At the crime scene, the bodies of Murata and Mori were also quickly discovered, and the authorities also found several items left behind, which, combined with the witness testimony and collected fingerprints, led them to swiftly identify the culprit as Akira Nishiguchi. With 4 prior convictions, Akira was now involved in his 5th and most severe crime yet. While he was already on the run with the cash, his escape would become increasingly difficult each day, as the police had now set out on an intense nationwide manhunt to apprehend him before anyone else would be harmed. After committing the double murders, records state that Akira had fled to a barbershop where his new girlfriend was working as a hairdresser. It comes as no surprise that a man like Akira, despite being married with children, was unfaithful, and reports suggest that one of the motivations behind his gruesome crime spree was to impress his new girlfriend with money. That night, they celebrated his newfound wealth by staying at an inn in Shinyanagi, and Akira slept soundly, convinced he had escaped the consequences of his actions. But the next morning brought a rude awakening. As he turned on the radio and picked up the local newspaper, he was stunned to see his name, face, and the details of his crime plastered across the front pages. Radio broadcasts were also constantly airing announcements from the police, urging the public to be on the lookout. In less than 24 hours, Akira's actions had turned him into Japan's most wanted man, and the entire country was now aware of the cruelty he had inflicted upon the 2 tobacco plant workers. However, luckily for him, both the radio and print news had contained a big mistake. News reports at the time suggested that Akira had fled to the Kansai region, when in reality, Akira had no intention of going there and was actually hundreds of miles away. To Akira, this error may have just bought him some time to escape, which is exactly what he had planned to do. But Akira knew that he couldn't run forever. He knew the police would relentlessly pursue him until he was caught. So, he devised a better plan. What if they thought he was dead? Perhaps if the police were convinced of his demise, they would call off the search. Days after the murder of the 2 plant workers, Akira fled to Karatsu, a small city nestled in Japan's countryside. While he was there, he wrote a letter addressed to the Yukuhashi police force. Here's an excerpt of that letter. I wish to inform you that the authorities are correct, and I am indeed the criminal responsible for the murders of the Japanese tobacco and Salt Public Corporation deliverymen. After committing the crime, I intended to flee with my mistress, but the regret I feel for my actions has made me decide to end things myself. I will never be caught by the police. I am very sorry. Akira Nishiguchi, Tokyo. On October 25th, acting on a tip-off, the police boarded a ferry traveling across the Seto Inland Sea between Kyushu and Tokyo. On board, they discovered several items belonging to Akira, including one of his jackets. Inside its pockets, police found a will that was signed by Akira himself. Assuming that he might have jumped into the sea, the Japanese Coast Guard launched an extensive search of the waters, while officers patrolled the coastlines. However, even after an intense search, Akira's body was nowhere to be found. Interviews with passengers and crew confirmed that he had been on the ferry at some point, and the items left on the deck were undoubtedly his. This had stumped the authorities, because they believed that there was no way Akira could have vanished without a trace. Hours later, police received a report from shore. Some of the employees from a gift shop at the dock had seen Akira in the area, which to the police only confirmed their suspicions. Realizing that he was alive and had indeed attempted to fake his own death, the manhunt intensified, and the police were now not going to let him slip away again. On October 28th, just 10 days after murdering the two men, Akira rented a room in Shizuoka, a city on Japan's south coast. Knowing he needed a disguise due to the widespread wanted posters and news about his crimes, he adopted the alias Masaoka and posed as a professor from Kyoto University. To maintain the charade, he donned thick glasses and a formal suit. At the rented apartment, Akira met the landlady, Yuki Fujimi. Perhaps charmed by his appearance and charisma, she began to develop feelings for him. Over the next 2 weeks, Yuki's affection for Akira intensified, until eventually, she invited him to stay in her private residence instead of the rented apartment. Tragically, this decision would cost her life. From his first night in Shizuoka, Akira would frequently call young women and geishas to his room. Records state that he would spend the night drinking or having fun with the women, funded by the money he had stolen from murdering the two deliverymen. When Yuki Fujimi, the landlady, learned that Akira was a successful university professor, she developed feelings for him and suggested they spend the night together. Akira agreed, but decided to leave early the next morning. Despite Yuki's protests and attempts to persuade him to stay, he left abruptly. We know that Akira was an evil man and a notorious womanizer. But why didn't he stay when the landlady asked him to? Well, the answer was simple. He was running out of money, and he knew it full well. Despite his fondness for female companionship, Akira knew that he had to keep acquiring money through illegal means to sustain his lavish lifestyle. And, with the police hot on his trail and every officer on the lookout for him, he needed funds to vanish. Having extravagantly spent most of his stolen money, he was forced to revert to fraud and murder to recover his losses. When he was a young boy, Akira dropped out of school and vowed to himself that he would become rich at any cost, even if it meant taking another person's life. However, he would soon realize that achieving this goal would not be as straightforward as he thought. By now, every police officer in the area was on high alert, relentlessly hunting him down. The walls were closing in, and Akira's days of evading justice were numbered. But before his capture, 3 more lives would be brutally cut short. After leaving the apartment in Shizuoka, Akira was desperate to replenish his funds. Hence, the first thing he did was to travel to Hiroshima, where he devised a new scheme. Posing as a wealthy investor, Akira called an electronics store and purchased 5 television sets, claiming they were a donation for a local orphanage. However, after Akira took possession of the 5 television sets, he didn't pay the supplier for them as he had promised. Instead, he left the supplier unpaid and made the orphanage responsible for the cost, even though they never actually received any TV sets. Stealing and fraud is a reprehensible act by itself, but burdening an orphanage with unpaid bills is even more despicable. Yet, Akira was unfazed by his actions. Without a second thought, he immediately pawned the televisions, netting approximately 80,000 yen. While this is about $500 today, in the 1960s, this amount was worth just over $5,000. Several days later, with the money in his pocket, Akira returned to his rented room in Shizuoka, much to the delight of Yuki. Overjoyed by his return, Yuki confessed her feelings for him once again and expressed that she didn't want him to sleep in the guest room anymore. She wanted him to sleep with her. Instead of letting Akira sleep in his usual room, she prepared a bed for him in her own room, hoping to grow closer. To impress Akira further, Yuki even donned a new kimono that was tailor-made in order to appear more attractive to him. For the next 4 nights, Akira stayed with her, indulging in her hospitality. It was also reported that Yuki's mother, who was also living in the building, frequently came down to offer tea and was known to be a gracious host. Yuki did everything she could to make Akira stay comfortable and pleasant. However, Akira's compulsion for crime resurfaced, and the dark urges that drove him could no longer be suppressed. On the night of November 18, 1963, Akira brutally strangled both Yuki and her mother with a rope tied around their necks. Once he was certain that they were dead, he quickly ransacked their residence, taking all their cash and valuables. He then headed to a pawn shop and sold everything for 40,000 yen. The following day, posing as a representative of Yuki's family, he sold their telephone line, netting an additional 100,000 yen before fleeing Shizuoka. On November 22nd, 4 days after Yuki and her mother were killed, authorities arrived at the apartment following multiple reports of a foul odor emanating from the building. Upon entering and conducting their initial investigations, they swiftly uncovered evidence that pointed to Akira Nishiguchi. This discovery significantly intensified the manhunt, with the police ordered to double their efforts to catch him. In response, police officers across the country were put on high alert. Additionally, investigators traveled to Beppu to have Akira's family members write letters urging his surrender, which were then printed in national newspapers. At the time, having a wanted person's poster featured in the newspapers was a big deal. Newspapers were the primary source of information for people, second only to radio. If Akira's name and photo made it to national headlines, it meant that the police were desperate to catch him. The records do not indicate whether Akira knew that the police had identified him as the killer of the 2 women in the apartment. However, it is clear that he was undeterred by the fact that close to every officer in the country was searching for him. For most criminals, having every pair of eyes in town on the lookout would force them into extreme hiding. But Akira was not like most criminals. Unfazed by the manhunt, he resurfaced in Chiba Prefecture on December 3, 1967. In Chiba, Akira continued to swindle people of their money. On one occasion, posing as an accountant for the Chiba District Court, he cheated a 61-year-old mother out of 6,000 yen, making her believe she was paying a fine for her son's traffic violations. On another occasion, he posed as a lawyer and took 50,000 yen from a 50-year-old mother who believed that she was paying her son's bail money. It was also reported that Akira traveled to Fukushima and stole a lawyer's badge from an office to further his impersonation. With his new disguise, he journeyed to Hokkaido. While there, he entered a store and swindled the owner out of 15,000 yen by showing the badge and threatening them with a crime they did not commit. Continuing his spree, Akira traveled south to Tokyo, where he swindled another 40,000 yen from someone who believed they were paying bail money for an imprisoned relative. At this point, it seemed that Akira was traveling around the country, solely to find more victims. And while it was clear that he was cunning, he was also extremely intelligent. He knew he couldn't stay in one place for too long, as word about his misdeeds would spread fast among the community. He also knew how to present himself convincingly to his victims, ensuring they wouldn't suspect a thing. Hearing about these multiple incidents of fraud that were scattered across the country, authorities intensified their efforts to warn the public about Akira. In response, they printed over 500,000 wanted posters featuring 3 pictures of him, along with detailed information about his appearance. These posters were then distributed nationwide, and radio broadcasts were also aired, urging members of the public to be on the lookout. By December of 1963, wanted posters bearing Akira's face were prominently displayed on every major building and in crowded public places. However, this message seemed to have no effect on the man himself, as he continued his spree with brazen confidence. Despite knowing he was now recognizable nationwide, he remained undeterred. Because as the pressure for his arrest mounted, so did his resolve to evade capture. Reports indicate that Akira Nishiguchi next surfaced during a train ride to Tokyo. On the train, he came across a newspaper story about Tairyu Furukawa, a Buddhist priest who was campaigning for the release of a prisoner named Sake Menda. Menda was a man who was convicted of a double homicide and sentenced to death in 1949, but many believed that he was wrongfully convicted and was in fact innocent. One of the people leading the campaign for Menda's release was Furukawa. Interestingly, Akira recalled meeting the priest previously when Furukawa had served as a chaplain at the prison where he had been jailed 10 years earlier. The 2 men reportedly had a brief encounter when he had to serve tea to Furukawa. This gave Akira an idea, but it had to wait as he was running out of money and needed a quick fix. Upon arriving in Tokyo, he approached Umematsu Kamiyoshi, an 81-year-old lawyer and member of the Tokyo Bar Association. Claiming to be a fellow lawyer, Akira offered to assist Kamiyoshi with the case he was working on. Kamiyoshi agreed and later invited Akira into his residence. However, upon Akira's arrival, he brutally strangled the elderly man with his necktie. He then ransacked the apartment, stealing all his valuables, including 140,000 yen in cash. Kamiyoshi's body was only discovered 4 days later, cruelly stuffed in his closet. This crime only intensified the immense pressure on the police to capture Akira. But no matter what they did, Akira had always managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities. On January 2, 1964, Akira visited a temple in Kumamoto, where Tairyu Furukawa resided. He introduced himself as Kawamura, a local lawyer interested in supporting the campaign for Sake Menda's release. Despite having a brief encounter with Akira in prison a decade earlier, Furukawa did not recognize him. Nonetheless, he readily accepted Akira's offer of assistance, unaware of the true identity and intentions of his new ally. However, Furukawa's 10-year-old daughter, Ruriko, noticed that her father's new colleague bore a striking resemblance to the wanted posters she had seen. Previously, Ruriko had noticed several wanted posters for the arrest of Akira Nishiguchi, but the only reason why a 10-year-old would pay any particular attention to the posters was because the name Nishiguchi was almost identical to that of one of her classmates, differing by only one character. This coincidence led her to inadvertently memorize Akira's mugshot. She also observed that his height had matched the description on the poster, and even noted that he had 2 distinct moles on his face, just like the ones depicted in the posters. Her suspicions began to grow as she observed the similarities, and she had to act on her intuition. Ruriko waited for the right moment to warn her parents, but when she finally did, she was met with anger. Her father accused her of being disrespectful to their guest and insisted that the visitor was, in his words, a messenger of happiness, because he had promised to help in the release campaign. In response, the 10-year-old objected and said, "No, he is a messenger of evil." Perhaps it was the tone of her voice, or her earnestness, because this compelled her parents to reconsider her claims. Furukawa began to observe Akira more closely and quickly noticed that he only had a fundamental knowledge of the law, despite claiming to be an established lawyer. This was the first telltale sign. The next sign were the moles on Akira's face. Furukawa had discreetly confirmed his suspicions by checking the wanted poster and comparing it to Akira's appearance. He was now almost certain that his new acquaintance was not Kawamura, but Japan's most wanted man. Realizing that his daughter was right, he stalled Akira by offering him a room for the night, while he locked his family in a secure section of the house. Meanwhile, Furukawa's wife and eldest daughter alerted the police. Early the next morning, with the house surrounded by officers, Akira Nishiguchi was finally apprehended. He offered no resistance as he was put into a police vehicle and driven away. Perhaps he knew that his time was up. While in police custody, Akira confessed to all charges and admitted that he had planned to kill Furukawa and his entire family after securing the money for Menda's release. He said that he was willing to murder an entire family just so he could get his hands on the money. When the police asked him why he resorted to murder and not stick with fraud, he said that fraud was troublesome and it is easier to kill. At his trial, which lasted nearly a year, he was convicted on all charges and sentenced to death on December 23, 1964. In a later appeal, his lawyers tried to argue that he was mentally unstable during the crimes, but this was unsuccessful. While in prison, Akira was frequently visited by Furukawa, the Buddhist priest he had plotted to murder. During the visits, Furukawa would continuously read religious literature to him, and though Akira was resistant at first, he eventually opened up and found common ground. Records say that during his time on death row, Akira would write letters to his children, urging them to live as law-abiding citizens and not to commit crimes. He also often cried whenever his eldest son would visit him in prison. On December 11, 1970, justice finally prevailed. After evading the law and leaving a trail of destruction, Akira Nishiguchi faced the noose. He was 44 when he was executed, and according to reports, his final words were, "Please, cast my ashes in Beppu Bay. Amen." Heinous, an Asian true crime podcast, is brought to you by One Up Media. This episode was produced and written by Guangjin, edited by Alex, narrated by Jason, audio experience by Ethan Sam, additional engineering by Ashley from One Up Media. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.